So another way to provide written feedback in an effective way that reduces workload is using whole class feedback. Whole class feedback has become more popular over the last few years and has been shown to be effective if it's done properly. Whole class feedback is a way of checking students' work and giving them feedback without faffing around with time-consuming written comments. It's been argued by Joe Kirby from Michaela School that written marking is useful for one child once only. So there are 3 reasons why individual written marking may not be as effective as it should be. The first one is when we give written feedback, we need to think, was the quality of the feedback as good as it could be? Were the children really able to understand what we want them to improve in a brief comment, and do they know how to do that? Do we sometimes compromise by turning feedback into shorter comments in child-friendly language? Secondly, with traditional written feedback, are children really taking responsibility for improving their own learning, or are they relying on us to identify their errors for them and then simply responding to our marking? So for example, by filling in missing full stops that have been helpfully located by their conscientious teacher. Finally, there is the issue and pressure of marking and workload. So we need to think, could that time maybe be better spent elsewhere? How often do we do written marking? I really think this flowchart here summarises it really well. So with whole class feedback, you can provide students with feedback that is timely, that is detailed and formative in nature, while considering the impact on teacher workload and allowing pupils to reflect on their feedback and move forward. With whole class feedback, essentially you take in students' work on paper or through Teams, read it all and jot down some common problems or things you want them to address. Then at the start of the next lesson, you go through these things and expect students to mend and correct their work. Feedback is collated and it's given to the class as a whole. This helps to close that time gap between work submission and providing feedback. Any common strengths will form the basis of the positive feedback to reinforce learning that's being done really well, and it will in turn provide a prompt to any in the class who are not yet doing those things. From your list of common errors, they need to check if any appear in their work and correct it or address it. During that time in class, in that review period, you can then quickly provide some additional one-to-one feedback to those you notice need some extra help when you were going through and reading them. You can make notes as well to either reteach something during that next lesson if it's clear there's a really common misunderstanding, or if it's not as urgent, certain things could be built into your planning for a future lesson or topic. So what kinds of templates do I use to do this? There are lots of different examples of whole class feedback templates and crib sheets online. It can depend on your subject, your teaching style, or the type of task, what you might want to do and what type of feedback sheet you might want to use, or you can feel free to make your own, but I've created some examples that you can download on the blog afterwards. So I'll run through some of these examples just now, and I'll show you some of the ones I've made as well. So this one here is a really nice one. This one has next steps in learning, a place for you to write misconceptions and errors, and then any pupils that need further support. It's also got little bits where you can think about what guided practice you're going to do, what things maybe the whole class might need to relearn and how they're going to do that, and any other things that might effectively help people check their work, etc. Here's another little example here, a couple of examples. So there's a history example and an English example here. Again, you can see kind of similar things. What some people do is they have a bit for SPAG errors, which is things like capitals, full stops, apostrophes, spelling errors, and then they have a separate bit for misconceptions, because that's the thing we're really trying to pull out here. And this person's also got a section for presentation as well. The really important thing here is praise, so praising those who have done really well and using those as examples. And it might want to be that you keep a list of anyone who has any missing or incomplete work as well. Here's another couple, so the one on the left, nice and clean one, quite short and easy, and the right's another English example. And again, you can just see the different ways that this can be laid out. So how would this work in practice using your Connected Falkirk device? Well, let's show you a little example here. So If my pupils have done the work on paper, you can just use the markup function on the iPad to write or type as you read it. But if my students' work is maybe on Teams or I've taken photos of it, well, you can use that split screen function that I showed you earlier and have the template open on your iPad alongside the pupil's work so that you can see it at the same time that you're taking your notes as well. You can also take notes just by typing on the Notes app or on Word. You can mark up in files, books or photos. You can also choose whether you want to sample work or read through the whole class's responses. Some people say that maybe sampling 10 pupils at a time, so some of the best pupils, some of the poorer ones, some in between, and then making sure to sample different pupils every time. I mean, obviously you wouldn't say to the class, I'm only going to sample 10 pupils, but it might be something that helps you then give more consistent and regular feedback. The most important bit of this is basically sharing this bit in class, which we'll move on to in a wee second. But at the moment, if I just show you this is one that I've made that I would use. So I have made this quick whole class feedback template. What I would do with this is I would have it in my files or in my photos on my iPad. And all I would do is do what I did earlier in terms of hitting edit and then mark up. And then I can use my pen on here to then add information. So maybe it is the 15th today. Maybe this is with my higher class. And then I can put in some information here. So maybe for praise, I want to give Ava some praise because she did a really excellent method section, etc, etc. I can write in some misconceptions, common errors that the whole class have made. So maybe everyone has some issues listing their apparatus, so I want to go through that. Independent tasks, so maybe when I'm done I want them to rewrite, etc, etc. For exemplars, maybe I want to use Jack's conclusion because I think it was a really good example to show the rest of the class. And anyone who's been off or has missing and incomplete work, I can put that there. Now I could write on that if I've got a stylus, etc. Or I can do the same thing I did before and tap the plus button and text, and I can add in text boxes under each of these to fill them in if I want to instead. So it's a really, really nice, simple way of just filling in a feedback form. I could keep these as well. So I could keep them in a folder and then I can keep track of throughout the year, how are my class doing when I give them feedback? Is there misconceptions and common errors that are coming up every single time that we do this as well? It's a really, really nice way to keep track of it digitally. Now, the most important bit of this is how you share it with the class. So modelling is essential in that self-improvement phase. So if students knew how to correct their work, they would have done it correctly to begin with. And a lot of feedback is things like, do this better. It's rather like kind of telling an unsuccessful comedian how to be funnier. It's accurate, but it's not particularly helpful advice. So lots of proponents of whole class feedback suggest sharing best work examples using a visualizer. So for example, your Apple TV and your iPad, like we looked at earlier. And this will give you a chance to include some praise shout-outs to celebrating the work of those pupils who did really well and using their work as examples for the rest of the class. As I mentioned earlier, it's really difficult to be excellent if they don't know what excellent looks like, so it's really important to model and show. I'd say the best bit of this for me as a teacher is that it provides me with an accurate snapshot of whole class progress. I can keep all of these in a folder and it makes it easier for feedback to influence my teaching and allows me to incorporate these points into my future planning by fine-tuning it. I need to teach students to overcome that misconception, and I always want to track that misconception over time to try and prevent it from happening again next year and to make sure it's fixed this year as well. I really like the quote that I'd read before about marking is planning. So for pupils, you could also save these without the names and upload them to Teams or for whole class use at a later date. If they're maybe going to do a similar piece of work again, it might be good to then have that there for them to access as well. So let's move on and have a look at DIRT. So the key here is that feedback without action is really unproductive. So we need to monitor whether pupils are actually using the feedback that you've given them. Sometimes I always need to remind myself that marking should be less work for you than for your students. And how often can we actually say that that's the case? Students have to become active users of feedback. You need to get them to think of feedback as a trigger to them taking action. They should not just be passive recipients of our comments, they need to understand their responsibility in the feedback process. This can be done in lots of different ways, but you need to create opportunities for students to interact with that feedback. Whether that's by setting a subsequent homework task to redraft a piece or part of work using the feedback given, or time in class to work with peers to explore action steps in response to feedback. Or maybe you want them to individually create certain goals or actions that they are going to take now to improve their work. Another example is getting pupils to respond to the feedback or do a subsequent task in class through using DIRT, or a level up task. DIRT stands for Directed Improvement and Reflection Time, and there's lots of different ideas and resources available online to help with it. Essentially, pupils spend their time listening to or reading our feedback and then put it into practice by setting overall targets and plans for future work and doing initial tasks which help them to apply what they've learned to a connected follow-up task, like rewriting parts of work or answering a similar question, embedding that feedback that they've now reflected on. DIRT tasks can depend on the subject and the task at hand. So in English, DIRT might be redrafting an essay. In maths, it might be a quick quiz with questions designed to specifically target those misconceptions. It could be slot booklets, so lots of similar questions on a topic or area, or carefully designed non-examples that pupils might mark and correct, or a replica of a question that students answered poorly the first time round. While students work on those DIRT tasks, that then gives you time to have one-to-one or small group conversations with pupils about their feedback and whether they have any questions. You can ask them quite open questions at that point, like what do you want to talk about, and make sure they have that time to talk to you about it. So that's just an example of a way to make sure they're actually using and actioning that feedback that you've painstakingly given. I found this really useful in my own classroom, trying to embed time to reflect and use feedback. And you can do things like using structure sheets, etc. for the feedback reflection if you want to as well. But it's definitely something that I would highly suggest you do, whether it's 15 minutes, half an hour at the start of the next period after you're giving them your feedback. I think it's really, really useful to make sure that feedback is worthwhile.